The following program is an original production of Link TV. They are 1/5 of the world's population, 1.2 billion people, Muslims. 56 countries from North Africa to Southeast Asia have Muslim majorities. While the Muslim people are a diverse group, the relationships between the United States and the Muslim world are too often marked by conflict and distrust. Many Americans, Muslims in other countries, and people around the world yearn for more peaceful and respectful relations.
The relationship between the United States and the Muslim world is the single largest issue of national security and safety to both the U.S. population and the rest of the world that we've faced since perhaps the nuclear standoffs.
It's particularly important to have a real initiative to change America's mode of interaction with the Muslim world and hopefully change their perceptions of us in the process.
America, I think, is an exceptional nation, and what we are for and should be for is diversity, respect for other religions.
Many people fear that further deterioration in U.S.-Muslim relations will continue to fuel the growth of extremism and the risk of catastrophic attacks. To address this concern, two groups dedicated to building consensus came together to create the U.S.-Muslim Engagement Project.
Overall, what we're looking to do here is signal the need for a substantial change of course and the opportunity for that change of course to lead to substantial improvement in relations.
But what should that change of course look like? What kinds of new strategies are needed? 34 experienced American leaders were called to be part of the U.S. Muslim Engagement Project's leadership group. The group includes a former Secretary of State, former members of Congress, a retired general, and other leaders from diverse religious, cultural, political, and business backgrounds. 1/3 of the members are Muslim, and all members of the leadership group gather around one table.
You had people of diverse views who came together for a reason. The reason was to see, are there bridges? Can we build understanding? Is there a way to transform the reality? The one thing's very clear. If you get together only with people who agree with you, well, what's the point? When you have basic misunderstandings, you have to find ways to see if they can be overcome.
Over 18 months, the group discussed, disagreed, and ultimately overcame differences to find common ground on dozens of specific recommendations on a wide range of issues detailed in this report. Changing course, a new direction for U.S. relations with the Muslim world. The new course they recommend focuses primarily on what actions the U.S. can take, but it also stresses the role of the leaders and peoples of Muslim-majority countries.
When we ask Muslims around the world what the Muslim world can do to improve relations with the West, their most frequent response is about controlling extremism. So there is a recognition among Muslims that this is a problem. In fact, when asked what their greatest fear is, many people say that their greatest fear in their own country is being a victim of terrorist attack.
In the U.S., misunderstandings abound. Polls show nearly half of Americans consider most Muslims to be violent, but only a tiny minority are. Many Americans also regard the conflict with the Muslim world to be inevitable. But hard data from the Gallup Center for Muslim Studies, which conducts polling across the Muslim world, found exactly the opposite.
The most important finding, though, was that the conflict between the United States and Muslim populations around the world is not inevitable, because anger is at our perceived actions, not our values or our principles. They talk about what they admire most about the West in general is transparency of government, the rule of law.
In other words, the so-called clash of civilizations, so widely discussed in Western media, is not borne out by what Muslims around the world say they want. While Muslims say they are frustrated by American actions, they admire American values, including broad support for democracy. The polling data also showed strong support for women's rights, including the right to vote. Majorities of Americans and Muslims abroad say they want peace and amicable relations, although there are certainly caveats.
There are important religious and cultural differences that are not easily resolved. But fundamentally, we think there's a series of policies and actions that we can change and they can change that can begin to create a much more peaceful relationship between the United States and the larger Muslim world.
We can work with problems, we can resolve problems when we have built relationships.
To build this improved relationship, the leadership group recommends a blueprint for change resting on 4 pillars. In short, diplomacy to resolve conflicts, better governance, economic reform, and mutual respect and understanding. The pillars are closely linked.
It's very important to see all 4 going together. I've always had a very hard time in any discussion that I have about political, economic, or ideological issues to separate them from each other. And I think when anything is complicated, you talk about it as multifaceted. So this is, in fact, a multifaceted issue, and those 4 pillars go together.
I think that what we have to say is, we have to be able to use force when it's in our national interests. But we also know that some of the deep-seated economic problems, cultural problems, political problems that exist in the region help to recruit people into terrorist movements that are precisely the thing that we're trying to fight in this country.
The first pillar calls on the U.S. government to use diplomacy as the main tool for resolving conflicts involving Muslim countries. The leadership group was passionate about this point.
On the table, and I think we should forcefully say that currently the options of conversation, dialogue, diplomacy, and even negotiations have been profoundly taken off the table in too many cases.
One crucial case for diplomacy is the U.S. relationship with Iran. The report calls on the U.S. government to engage with Iran to explore the potential for agreements that could increase regional security.
So there is a competition with Iran throughout the region, and the question is how to deal with it. If you look at their behavior, in fact, is changeable from time to time. So it's in our interest to see if there's a way to alter Iranian behavior. I believe it's possible to change the Iranian behavior, but I think it requires a combination of sticks and carrots.
The report also calls for the U.S. to work intensively for de-escalation of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and a viable path to a 2-state solution that ensures the security of both peoples.
The U.S. has to be more involved diplomatically in trying to resolve a problem that's very difficult. I don't think anybody would say that it's been easy and people haven't worked on it, but it isn't the only issue, but it is the one that is pointed to a great deal as a sign that the 2 worlds can't come together.
The first pillar also calls for deepening U.S. investments in conflict resolution and political reconciliation in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan. The second pillar calls on the U.S. government and civic organizations to promote good governance and help expand civic participation in Muslim countries.
When they complain about their government, that's what they complain about, corruption and things don't work. They just want things to work. And the corruption is all the way down, and lack of efficient functioning of institutions, of state institutions. They're supposed to serve them. So
when Americans talk about promoting democracy, you shouldn't think first and foremost about having an election. There are certain things that you have to have in order to get to the point of being a successful functioning democracy. You have to have respect for women and minority groups, and you have to have viable political parties that actually represent the interests of people. You have to have certain protections of civil liberties, access to media. There are a whole bunch of things that have to happen that we again call the preconditions of democracy.
It's very difficult when you're talking about trying to transform societies, when you're trying to produce what amounts to a kind of social, economic, political development. It's very important that you do so on the basis of institutions.
The third pillar calls on the U.S. government and business leaders to help catalyze job-creating growth in Muslim countries.
The people that travel through the region will know well that if they were given a list of choices, what do you want to change now? I think number 1 would be the acute conflicts. Number 2 would be the economic realities. I want my kid to get a job. I want the education that he has to mean something. I want there to be an economy that's functioning and transparent and free.
Some of these countries, as I think we allude here, have as much as 50% of their gross domestic product captured by the gray market. The way ahead on that is to is to reduce those barriers to entry in such metrics as how many days or weeks or months does it take to license a business, how effective is contract enforcement, and so on.
This third pillar calls for economic policy reforms and new investments to help generate jobs in Muslim countries. Currently, even bankruptcy laws make it highly risky to do something as simple as open a business.
We mentioned reforming the insolvency and bankruptcy regimes in these countries to decriminalize bankruptcy. For goodness sakes, if you put your capital at risk and go bankrupt, you're thrown into jail and you're a criminal.
This third pillar also recommends the use of trade agreements to reward economic reform and spur investment.
So if we're serious about seeing the Islamic community grow and prosper, free trade agreements, gold standard free trade agreements, I think is indispensable to allow the nascent economic well-being of these countries in the Islamic community to be unfettered, to grow.
Finally, the fourth pillar. It calls on Americans and Muslims around the world to improve mutual respect and understanding through education, exchange, and interfaith dialogue. After the leadership group was formed, the U.S. Muslim Engagement Project also organized citizen dialogues across the country. While those sessions showed that Americans face a steep learning curve about Islam and the diversity of Muslim cultures, people also expressed a yearning to learn more.
The results of the dialogue were then fed back into the leadership group discussions so that when the leaders were discussing what can change, they were able to take into consideration thoughts and concerns that were expressed.
To address Americans' need to learn more, the U.S. Muslim Engagement Project recommends dramatically expanding cross-cultural education and people-to-people exchanges.
I come from that generation of practitioners who used to say, X problem is complicated enough. Let's not bring God and religion into it. But the more that I learned, the role of religion is very large, and therefore our diplomats and our politicians need to become versed in the religious background of various conflicts that we have and develop the right language to be able to have a dialogue.
To commence that dialogue, the report issues a call for action to the next U.S. president, specifically recommending that he speak to the need for improving relations with the Muslim world in the 2009 inaugural address. Then, in the administration's first months, announce and start to implement a strategy to improve U.S. Muslim relations. Reaffirm the U.S. prohibition of torture. Begin a major diplomatic effort to resolve regional conflicts and promote security and cooperation in the Middle East, engaging with Iran and seeking permanent resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict should have the highest priority. Convene a business-government summit on economic reform in the Middle East, and create an international initiative for Americans and Muslims around the world to learn about each other's history, culture, and societies. Taken together, the 150-page report, with its 4 pillars and presidential call to action, present a dramatic, perhaps monumental challenge. But the leadership group says it is one the United States must take on.
This is the risk for our children and grandchildren for the 21st century, and we haven't gotten it right. In many cases, we've gotten it profoundly wrong. We've created a situation in which a billion people in this world are at risk of hating the United States. Now, they don't yet, but increasing numbers of them do. The fact is we're going to have to change course.
We have a stake in ensuring that those who believe in creating a more hopeful future, a future that is a more tolerant future, a future that is governed by non-corruption and the embodiment of justice, is something that is not only good for the people in those countries, but it's also very good for the United States.